Imagine driving into a small Canadian town where the grocery store, the gas station, the newspaper, and even the forest surrounding it all belong to one family. Prices, headlines, and even the very air you breathe are quietly tied to their control. The locals whisper that you can't live in New Brunswick without touching something owned by the Irvings. Power isn't about money, it's about control. That line could have been written for the Irving family, but who are they? How did a single clan come to dominate not just one industry, but an entire region of a country? And why does so little leak out about them compared to America's Rockefellers or Waltons? Step inside the province, and it feels less like a democracy and more like a company town, where nearly every paycheck, headline, and drop of fuel flows back to one family. This isn't Toronto, this isn't New York. This is a single Canadian province, effectively run by the Irvings, one of the richest, most secretive dynasties in North America. To answer that, we need to step into the world of the Irving dynasty, one of the richest and most mysterious families in Canada. And like every empire, their story begins with a single man. The story begins in 1860 with James Durgavell Irving, J.D. A shipbuilder's son, J.D. understood two things better than anyone. Lumber built fortunes, and control kept them. In 1882, he opened a sawmill in Bouctouche, New Brunswick. But J.D. wasn't satisfied with sawdust profits. He bought the forests that fed the mill, the ships that carried the wood, and the markets that paid for it. The Wed Court of the Counselor in Popular, the one time surprised the bill with a Peters for the whole chain. He created a loop where every dollar spent flowed back into his pocket. That habit, owning every piece of the chain, would become the family's trademark. J.D. didn't just build businesses, he built something else. A family culture of secrecy, loyalty, and control. Those values, more than any invention, would outlast him. And when J.D. passed away in 1933, his son, Kenneth Colin Irving, would take those seeds and grow them into something so big, it would shape an entire province, who would make the family name legendary. And we would take the family name legendary was a way to get. Kenneth Colin Irving, known as KC, was the man who turned his father's sawmill into a kingdom. Born in 1899, KC grew up under his father's watch, but quickly showed a hunger for more. KC was relentless, ambitious, and suspicious of publicity. By 1924, barely in his mid-20s, he launched Irving Oil. Cars were still rare, but KC was betting on the future. He didn't just refine oil, he bought the stations that sold it, the trucks that moved it, the ships that imported it. By the mid-20th century, if you lived in New Brunswick, you lived in Irving's world. By the 1940s, he wasn't just running businesses, he was running New Brunswick. Irving trucks carried goods, Irving fuel-powered cars, Irving papers printed the headlines. Entire towns lived on Irving jobs. People didn't just work for him, they lived inside his system. The Irving name was everywhere. Oil, trucking, shipping, forestry, newspapers, construction. The family wasn't just in business, they were the business. And when workers dared to resist, KC showed what his control really meant. In 1963, the St. John refinery, his crown jewel, was paralyzed by a strike. For 6 months, workers fought for higher pay. Fuel shortages rippled through New Brunswick, tensions gripped the province, but in the end, KC didn't just survive. But KC refused to yield. In the end, the strike collapsed and his grip tightened. From then on, he wasn't just a businessman, he was the boss. KC didn't just build, he engineered control. He created towns where Irving houses, Irving schools, and Irving jobs tied families for generations. And the secrecy? That was deliberate. KC believed publicity was a liability. The less the outside world knew about the family, the harder it was to challenge them. By the time KC died in 1992, he had built one of the most powerful private empires in Canada: oil, forestry, shipping, construction, media, and beyond. And he made sure his empire would not scatter. He split it carefully among his 3 sons, each given a different piece of the machine. And that decision, the three-headed dynasty, defined the next chapter of the Irvings, Canada's most secretive dynasty. When Casey Irving died in 1992, his empire didn't die with him. Instead, it split, neatly but powerfully, between his three sons. Each inherited a kingdom. Each commanded an empire so vast that together they essentially were New Brunswick's economy. Arthur Irving, the oil king. Arthur took Irving Oil. That meant the St. John refinery, Canada's largest, pumping out over 320,000 barrels per day. Irving Oil wasn't just big in Canada. It supplied fuel across New England, with over 900 gas stations stretching from Atlantic Canada to Boston. By the 2000s, its annual revenues were estimated at $8 to $10 billion, making it one of the largest privately held companies in the country. To put that in perspective, Irving Oil's annual revenues rivaled the entire provincial government budget of New Brunswick. J.K. Jack Irving, the industrialist. Jack controlled J.D. Irving Limited, the forestry and industrial arm. His reach was staggering, 2 million hectares of timberland, making the family the largest private landowner in Canada. That's an area bigger than the entire nation of Slovenia, controlled by one family. The company operated sawmills, pulp and paper plants, tissue factories, shipyards, food processing facilities, and transportation lines. By the 2010s, J.D. Irving employed over 16,000 people and generated an estimated $10 billion in annual revenue. In practical terms, if you lived in New Brunswick, chances were your job, your newspaper, or even your toilet paper came from the Irving machine. James Irving, the retail and shipping prince. James steered the retail, construction, and transportation side. He built the Kent Building Supplies chain, one of Canada's largest home improvement retailers, and dominated shipping with fleets of trucks in deepwater ports. Irving's shipbuilding in Halifax became a centerpiece of Canada's naval contracts, winning a $25 billion federal deal in 2011 to build warships for the Royal Canadian Navy. His branch was smaller in direct revenue but wielded immense strategic power through contracts with Ottawa. Together the scale. By the late 1990s, the Irving brothers collectively controlled companies employing over 20,000 workers in a province with a population of just 750,000. That meant 1 in every 12 jobs in New Brunswick traced back to the family name. Their combined revenues exceeded $18–20 billion annually, a figure larger than the GDP of Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick combined at the time. To outsiders, the Irving Empire looked like business. To New Brunswickers, it looked like a rule. The three-way split kept the empire stable. But stability came with a price, because with so much power in so few hands, questions began to rise. How much influence is too much? And the first signs of tension weren't about money, they were about information. To answer that, you have to look not at their oil fields or forests, but at their newspapers. In most places, the press acts as a watchdog, keeping the powerful in check. In New Brunswick, the press was the Irving family. At their peak, the Irvings owned almost every English-language daily newspaper in the province. The Telegraph-Journal, St. John, the Times and Transcript, Moncton, the Daily Gleaner, Fredericton, plus a dozen weeklies scattered across towns and villages. By the 2000s, nearly 85% of the province's newspaper circulation flowed through Irving-owned presses. That level of concentration was unmatched anywhere else in North America. For comparison, media watchdogs noted that no U.S. state, not even in the heyday of Hearst or Murdoch, had such a high concentration of local press power. And it wasn't just printing papers, it was shaping what people read, and more importantly, what they didn't. Reporters described an invisible boundary. Cover local sports, cover community life, but don't touch Irving business practices too hard. Stories about strikes, layoffs, or environmental damage often got buried or softened. A St. John journalist once quipped, "We don't write about the Irvings, we write around them." The monopoly ran deeper than the newsroom. The Irvings owned the paper mills that produced the newsprint, the trucking fleets that distributed the papers, and the ads from their own companies that funded them. In other words, the media wasn't just dependent on the family, it was part of the family machine. Critics called this the concentration of power squared. Not just vertical integration of industries, but vertical integration of truth. Imagine living in a place where the same last name stamps your paycheck, your gas pump, your toilet paper, and then your morning newspaper. This monopoly wasn't about making money. Newspapers weren't huge profit centers. It was about shaping the narrative. When environmentalists raised concerns about deforestation or pollution, those stories didn't always make the front page. When workers complained about labor conditions, coverage was muted. Take the 1963 refinery strike we mentioned earlier. Thousands of workers walked off the job against Irving Oil. In most provinces, that would dominate front pages for weeks. In New Brunswick, Irving-owned papers downplayed the unrest, framed it as a disruption to local business, and quickly shifted attention back to community fairs and local hockey scores. And here's the twist. While the Irvings dominated print, they avoided TV and radio ownership. Some say this wasn't restraint but strategy. Why fight for fragmented media markets when controlling the newspaper industry gave them the loudest, most trusted voice in small communities? This wasn't accidental, it was systemic. The family owned the forests that supplied the pulp, the mills that turned pulp into newsprint, the trucks that delivered the papers, and the companies that bought the ads. As one media analyst put it, the Irvings don't just own the media, they own the supply chain of reality itself. And the numbers made it undeniable. By the 1990s, the Telegraph-Journal alone reached more than 70,000 households daily, while the Times and Transcript added another 60,000. In a province of just over 700,000 people, Irving Inc. touched almost every kitchen table. For decades, New Brunswickers grew up in an environment where the Irvings were everywhere but rarely questioned. And for outsiders, the silence around the family only added to their mystique. By the mid-2000s, watchdog groups and academics began warning that democracy in New Brunswick was distorted. Citizens weren't just consumers of Irving products, they were consumers of an Irving-approved reality. But in recent years, cracks have appeared. The rise of digital media and independent voices has challenged the family's grip on information. And when critics finally got a chance to speak, they had a lot to say, especially about oil and the environment. Which leads us to one of the biggest controversies facing the dynasty today. If newspapers gave the Irvings influence, oil gave them control. The jewel of the empire was the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John, opened in 1960 and expanded again and again until it became a continental giant. Today, it is the largest oil refinery in Canada and one of the largest in North America, capable of producing more than 320,000 barrels of oil per day. To put that in perspective, that's more oil than entire countries like Iceland, Latvia, or Ireland consume in a day. At peak output, the refinery shipped nearly 60% of Canada's gasoline exports to the U.S. Northeast, fueling Boston, New York, and beyond. Irving Oil's annual revenues, estimated at $8 to $10 billion Canadian, have at times come close to matching the entire annual budget of the province of New Brunswick, which hovers around $11 to $12 billion. One company, nearly the size of the government itself, but with that dominance came confrontation. In 1963, just 3 years after the refinery opened, a bitter strike shut the plant down. Thousands of workers walked out over wages and conditions. Kenneth Colin Irving refused to bend. He leaned on allies in government and in his own media empire, which portrayed the strike as reckless union disruption. After weeks of pressure, the refinery restarted on Irving's terms. It was a chilling demonstration of KC's mantra, control at all costs, and the disputes never really stopped. In 1979, an explosion sent toxic smoke over St. John. Citizens raised alarms, but Irving-owned papers gave the incident restrained coverage. By the 1990s, St. John had been labeled one of Canada's most polluted cities, with fingers pointed at Irving's refinery and pulp mills. Yet stricter regulations often stalled, as provincial governments weighed jobs and tax revenue against environmental reform. In 2004, Irving Oil announced plans for a $7 billion expansion, a single private project worth more than half of New Brunswick's entire GDP that year. Approvals were fast-tracked. Critics said debate was stifled. The math is staggering. In some years, Irving Oil's taxes alone contributed more to the province than several other top employers combined. And that created a unique reality. No premier in Fredericton wanted to risk those dollars. and no prime minister in Ottawa wanted to endanger a refinery that supplied America's eastern seaboard. Observers began to call it a shadow government, not because the Irvings ran legislatures directly, but because the economic weight of their empire tilted the playing field. For ordinary New Brunswickers, this was a double-edged sword. The refinery was both a source of pride and the province's greatest vulnerability. If Irving oil sneezed, New Brunswick caught a cold. By the 2000s, the Irvings weren't just producing oil, they were producing leverage, the kind that stretched from St. John's waterfront through the provincial legislature in Fredericton to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. But size comes with scrutiny. In 2025, the New York Times reported on the environmental costs of the family's empire. Critics argued that the refinery, combined with the family's forestry operations, gave the Irvings a stranglehold not just on the economy, but also on the province's natural resources. Environmental activists claimed the family's control of the media muted debates around climate change, deforestation, and pollution. The Irvings denied it, saying they follow regulations and provide jobs in regions where work is scarce. Still, the image of a family quietly steering both the economy and the conversation has raised alarm far beyond Canada's borders. And yet, despite all this scrutiny, the Irvings keep growing. Their wealth is spread across oil, lumber, shipbuilding, trucking, and real estate, and they continue to rank among the richest families in Canada, though the exact number is hard to pin down, because secrecy remains their favorite weapon. Succession in family dynasties is always dramatic, and the Irvings are no exception. Arthur Irving, now in his 90s, has prepared his children to take over Irving Oil. His daughter Sarah Irving has emerged as a key executive, representing the next face of the empire. James K. Irving's children are also active in J.D. Irving Limited, continuing the forestry business. But here's the twist. Unlike American dynasties where heirs live in the spotlight, the Irvings train their successors to stay in the shadows. The culture of secrecy hasn't gone away. It's being passed down like a family heirloom. Some wonder if the younger Irvings will embrace a more modern, transparent approach. Others believe they'll double down on silence, keeping their wealth and power hidden behind boardroom doors. The question remains, in an era of digital transparency, can the most secretive dynasty in Canada stay invisible? The Irving family is more than just a Canadian business dynasty. They are a reminder of how power can concentrate quietly, without fanfare, until one day you realize that a single family owns the stores you shop in, the forests you walk through, the gas you pump, and even the news you read. From J.D. Irving's humble sawmill to KCC's iron grip, to Arthur James and Jack's modern empire, the Irvings have built a world within a world, one that most Canadians live inside without ever seeing the walls. They own the forests you walk in, the gas you pump, the trucks you pass, even the news you read. And in New Brunswick, their presence is so deep, it's hard to imagine life without them. Their story isn't finished. The next generation will decide whether this secretive dynasty stays hidden or finally steps into the light. But one thing is certain. In New Brunswick and across Canada, you can't escape the shadow of the Irvings.